They laughed at me like I was a joke, like I didn't belong in my own family, like I was the foolish old woman asking for too much with trembling hands and a smile too kind for this cruel world. All I had asked for was $500 to fix the leaking roof in the old cottage where I raised their son, where memories still clung to the walls like old wallpaper. But my daughter-in-law scoffed, rolled her eyes, and said in front of everyone, doesn't she have any shame begging for money at her age? I didn't say anything then, not because I couldn't, but because I knew they had forgotten who I used to be, and I wanted them to. I had spent the last few years living simply almost invisibly after my husband died. The world felt smaller, colder. My son got married and drifted away, and his wife, well, she made it clear that I was only welcome when she needed someone to watch the kids or water the plants when they traveled. She dressed in designer clothes, through elaborate parties, posted every smile online like it was proof of her perfection, but I saw through it all the way she looked at me like I was a burden, something she was forced to tolerate because of blood and marriage. The day I asked for the money was quiet gray skies, the kind that make everything feel heavier. The cottage had sprung a leak in the bedroom right over the bed I had shared with my late husband. I didn't want much, just enough to fix it, so I didn't have to sleep with a bucket next to my pillow. I called him over, tried to speak gently, but the moment the words left my mouth, she laughed. My son said nothing, just stood beside her like a shadow, and then she said it loudly, sharply. $500 is a lot for someone who hasn't. It worked in years, maybe you should sell some of your junk antiques or something. I smiled, I nodded, I thanked them for coming and walked them to the door. But in my heart something shifted, not out of anger, but from the cold realization that they didn't know me at all. They thought I was poor, fragile, maybe even desperate, but what they didn't know was that for the past 40 years, I had been the quiet partner in a company my husband built from scratch, a tech company that quietly exploded after his death, and I had never touched a cent of the inheritance. We had no flash, no lavish spending, just old habits and a quiet life. But that evening I changed. I walked to the bank, the same one I had visited for decades. The manager recognized me, smiled politely, and asked how he could help. I said I'd like to withdraw $1.5 billion from my account, please. His smile faltered. He laughed nervously, thinking I was joking, until I handed him the account details, the passcodes, the legal documents. His face paled. He stuttered, asked if I was sure. I had never been more sure of anything in my life. But then something strange happened. The transaction triggered a red flag at the federal level. The account was so large, so untouched, that the system assumed it was fraudulent. The bank froze the transfer, and within an hour, security and corporate offices were involved. But that wasn't what made it interesting. It was when the news reached my daughter-in-law, because her friend worked at that very bank. Within hours, she was at my doorstep, lips trembling, hands clutched together, trying to act casual. She asked how I was, if I needed anything, if I had eaten. I invited her in, watched her fidget on my couch, and then finally asked the question. I was waiting for what's going on with your bank account. I smiled softly, took a sip of tea, and said, sometimes people assume things about others just because they are quiet or old or don't flaunt what they have. I think you should be careful making those kinds of assumptions. Her face drained of color, and I knew then this story was just beginning. She didn't speak right away. I could see her mind working, spinning, trying to backpedal without admitting guilt. Maybe she thought she could charm her way into my good graces, or that I would hand her a check just to keep her quiet. But I had spent a lifetime watching people try to manipulate others for money, and I had learned early that silence was the best weapon. Let people talk long enough and they'd expose their own intentions. She leaned forward and asked if the rumors were true. If I really had over $1 billion frozen in some secret account. I looked her in the eye and said, I suppose it depends who's asking. A family member who mocked me for needing a roof repaired, or someone genuinely concerned for my well-being? Her smile wavered, then vanished completely, and she tried to laugh it off, said she was only joking that day, that she hadn't meant to be rude, that she just didn't know I was serious. I nodded slowly, watching her squirm. I told her I hadn't changed my will in years, and that after my husband died, I hadn't really seen the point, but maybe it was time to revisit it. She perked up instantly, too quickly, and I saw at that flicker of greed she tried to mask with fake concern. She asked if I needed help setting up an appointment with an attorney, or maybe she could take me to lunch and we could talk through things. I thanked her politely and told her I had it handled. But when she left, I didn't go back to my quiet life. I opened the journal my husband had left me hidden at the back of his old office drawer in the cottage. It had notes scribbled in his careful handwriting, instructions, reminders and thoughts about our family, about the company, about the money. He had written something that now echoed loudly in my mind. If they ever stop seeing your value, show them what they missed. I called my lawyer the next morning and scheduled a full estate review, but I didn't stop there. I also made an appointment with a financial advisor and a nonprofit consultant, because what I had in mind wasn't just about revenge or pride. It was about legacy, about using what we built to help people who truly needed it, people who wouldn't laugh at an old woman asking for help. Word started to spread through the family. My son called for the first time in weeks, asked if I was okay, if there was anything I needed. I said no. He hesitated and then asked if he could drop by this weekend, maybe bring the kids. He sounded nervous, like he wasn't sure how welcome he was anymore. I said, of course, you're always welcome, but bring raincoats, the roof's still leaking. He didn't laugh, just went quiet. The next day, I received a message from my daughter-in-law, a long one full of praise and apologies and flattery. She said she'd love to help with renovations, maybe even design the interior, and that we could make it beautiful together. I didn't respond. Instead, I drove to a small children's shelter on the edge of town, a place my husband and I had donated to once quietly without a nameplate. I met the director and asked her what her biggest dream was. If money weren't an issue, she looked at me like I was joking, then cautiously said she'd love to expand by the building next door, create a long-term care wing for the kids with no placement options. I nodded, wrote down the details, and told her I'd be in touch. The gratitude in her eyes, the tears that welled up, reminded me of who I was before I became a footnote in someone else's story. This wasn't about proving anything to my daughter-in-law or my son anymore. It was about reclaiming a life that had been underestimated for far too long, and as I walked back to my car, I felt lighter, like maybe, just maybe, I was finally ready to start living again. 3 days later, I received an invitation to a family dinner, not from my son, but from his wife, a glossy card hand-delivered by a courier addressed only to me in calligraphy. That was far too elegant for something so transparent. I turned it over in my hands, wondering what game she thought she was playing now. It was being held at a new upscale restaurant downtown, the kind of place that served food in portions so small they had to describe them like art on the menu. My first instinct was to throw the invitation away, but then I remembered something my husband had once said: if people try to make a show out of you, make sure you own the stage. So I RSVP'd yes, and I arrived 5 minutes early wearing the same navy coat I'd worn when I first met my husband all those years ago back, when neither of us had a dollar to spare, but hearts full of ambition. I walked in and saw their surprise. First, my son standing awkwardly, then my daughter-in-law dressed like she was hosting a gala. She rushed to greet me, air-kissed both sides of my face, and complimented my shoes, ones she had once mocked me for wearing to a church picnic. She pulled out a chair and ordered wine before I even sat down, and then the performance began. She gushed about family unity, about healing old wounds, and how she wanted us all to grow closer. She even mentioned how she'd been researching charities and was so inspired by my recent generosity. I smiled politely and sipped my water. I asked her what inspired her sudden interest in giving back. She blinked, then stumbled through a vague story about wanting to be a better role model for her children, about setting an example. I nodded and said, children do notice everything, especially who shows up when things aren't easy and who disappears. She smiled tightly, sensing I wasn't there to be convinced, but she wasn't giving up. She mentioned that with all the media buzz around philanthropy and legacy planning, she and my son had been considering starting a family foundation that could carry the name forward, that it would be such a shame if all the wealth was just sitting there unutilized. I asked her gently how she knew how much was sitting there. She froze for just a second, then said something about headlines and rumors and how everyone was talking. I leaned in just a little and said the thing about rumors is that they always reveal who's listening closest. Dinner went on awkwardly, my son barely speaking, clearly uncomfortable. I didn't blame him. I knew he was caught between loyalty and guilt, torn between a mother he'd neglected and a wife whose ambition had grown sharper than love. When dessert came, a tiny square of chocolate cake with a petal on top, she smiled and said, so what do you think? Should we build this foundation together? Should we honor your legacy the right way? I looked her in the eyes and said, I already have. She blinked. What do you mean? I told her about the shelter, about the expansion, about how it would be named after my husband, and not a single dollar would pass through family hands. She went pale, the smile disappeared, and for the first time, she looked like she truly saw me not as the quiet background figure in her carefully curated life, but as the woman who built an empire beside her husband and could tear it all down with one quiet decision. I stood up, placed my napkin on the table, and thanked them for dinner. Then I walked out into the cold night, air heart pounding but strangely calm. I didn't need to yell or argue or punish. I had already done what mattered. The legacy wasn't a number in a bank account. It was the choice to give with purpose, not permission. The next morning, I woke to a string of missed calls and 2 long messages from my son. Both sounded apologetic but vague, like he was torn between defending her and not wanting to lose me completely. He said things like she didn't mean to come off that way, and maybe we all just misunderstood each other. But I hadn't misunderstood a thing. I knew exactly what this was. It wasn't about charity or legacy or family. It was about control. They'd built a life assuming I would one day hand over the keys, without question, and now that they saw I wouldn't, they were scrambling. I didn't reply to the messages. I needed time and space, and honestly, I was done making myself smaller to keep the peace in someone else's house. Instead, I drove to the shelter. It wasn't finished yet, but the walls were up. The roof was on, and for the first time, I could see the shape of what we were building. There were rooms where women could rest safely. Without fear, there were play spaces for children who had seen too much too young. There was a tiny library, because sometimes all you need is a quiet place to remember who you are. I stood in what would be the kitchen and thought of my husband, thought of all the meals we'd shared, thought of the nights we'd sat in silence after long days, tired but together. I imagined him here, his laugh, his hands helping with the build, and it was the first time in weeks I didn't feel angry or betrayed. I felt proud, not of the money, of the choice, of the impact. That evening, I got a visit from my granddaughter, the older one, 14, sharp, kind, and painfully aware of the tensions around her. She asked if she could spend the night, and I said yes even before she explained. We sat on the porch sipping cocoa. She said, Mom says you're mad at her. I told her I wasn't mad, I was just finally setting things right. She nodded, then asked Grandma, is it true you gave away all your money? I laughed, not all of it, but enough. She looked thoughtful, then said, That's kind of amazing. I asked why. She said, because I thought when people had a lot, they just kept trying to get more. Her words hit me harder than I expected. They reminded me of something I had forgotten somewhere along the climb. That wealth isn't a reward, it's a responsibility. And if you're not using it to lift someone else, it's just a burden. Later that night, I found her sitting in my office looking through old photo albums. She asked me about Grandpa, and I told her stories. I hadn't told anyone in years. The way he used to whistle off key, how he always burned the toast. How he left little notes in the car for me to find when I drove alone. We laughed until our stomachs hurt. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. It was about legacy. And legacy isn't built in bank accounts. It's built in moments like this. In voices passed down. In stories remembered. In the decision to stand for something, even if you have to stand alone. A week later, I stood at the grand opening of the shelter, the ribbon crisp. Between my fingers as reporters gathered nearby microphones, ready cameras clicking. Some of the women from the early intake program stood behind, me eyes wide with both pride and disbelief, and a few local leaders nodded politely, waiting for their moment in the spotlight. But none of that mattered to me. What mattered was that we'd built something that would outlast pain, outlast ego, outlast inheritance. When I finally cut the ribbon, the room erupted in gentle applause, but I wasn't. And watching the cameras, I was watching the little girl in the back, holding her mother's hand. She couldn't have been more than 5. Her hair tangled, her shoes too big. She looked so much like my own granddaughter once did, and I knew then this place was for her and the thousands like her. That evening, my son showed up unannounced. He stood on my porch in silence, holding a folded letter in his hand, his shoulders lower than I'd ever seen them, and without speaking, he handed it to me. I unfolded it slowly. Inside was an apology, not perfect, not polished, but raw and real. He said he'd let ambition blind him. Said he thought money meant security and status, and maybe even love, but watching the world react to what I'd done made him question everything. Watching the community rally, the women celebrate the media shift. Their attention from gossip to good had shaken something in him. He wrote, I was angry because I thought you were walking away from us, but I see now you were walking towards something, and I think I want to follow. I didn't cry right away. I just held the letter against my chest and breathed deeply, the kind of breath that feels like it pulls sunlight into your bones. We didn't solve everything that night, but we started something new. He asked if he could volunteer at the shelter, help with the garden, maybe donate quietly. I nodded and said yes, not because I needed his help, but because I wanted him to see that legacy is chosen, not inherited. As we walked through the shelter that night under dim lights and fresh paint, he paused near the kitchen, the same place I'd stood just days earlier, and said, "This feels like home." I smiled and replied, "That's the point." My daughter-in-law didn't come that night, but I heard later she'd started therapy. She was asking hard questions about herself, about worth, about control. I didn't wish her harm, I never did. I just wished her clarity. And maybe in her own time she'd find it. My granddaughter visits often. Now we bake, we read, we laugh, and once she asked, "Me, Grandma, when I grow up, can I do something like this too?" I pulled her close and whispered, "You already are." Because legacy isn't something you leave behind. It's something you live every day, in every choice, in every brave, quiet decision to be better than you were yesterday. And as I watched her walk through the shelter, smiling at strangers with her head held high, I realized my greatest wealth was never in a bank. It was in that moment, right there, alive and continuing, long after the numbers disappeared, long after the doors closed, in the hearts we'd touched, and the lives still being rewritten because of one bold decision to rewrite my own.